Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. It looks like we have a nice group with us today. So we'll go ahead and get started with the Kentucky Monthly Climate Perspective on Drought and Hydrologic Conditions. I have Dr. Stuart Foster, who will be running the presentation.
And we had a little bit of glitch here getting started, so I apologize for a slightly delayed beginning. So, but thank you for being with us today. Month of July was certainly an interesting month of weather for us. And so we'll summarize all that and then take a look ahead here today. So if you've been on our calls before, you're familiar with this slide, and just giving credit to all the folks that helped to make this possible, including our partnership with the National Integrated Drought Information System and the Midwest Drought Early Warning System, as well as our many wonderful partners across the state of Kentucky. Our next webinar scheduled for September 5th at the same time. And I believe that Chip Zimmer with the Division of Water is planning to be the presenter next month. So we're going to change things up a little bit. This webinar is being recorded. We've been trying to send out a link once we get the recorded webinar back and reviewed and such, so that you'll be able to have record of this. We'll talk about recent conditions, looking at temperature, precipitation, soil moisture, stream flows, and we'll hint at that word drought a little bit this month. We'll talk about some impacts that we're seeing across the state, and those continue to be mainly in the agricultural sector. Outlooks, we saw an update on the monthly outlook from CPC, so we'll take a look at that, as well as some shorter and then seasonal period outlook also. Summarize the main themes from the presentation and then have time for some questions and discussion. Pictures on the left there, in the top, you see something that's going to become more typical here this time of year. As we move into the month of August, we start to have a little shorter days, a little more cooling in the overnight period, and start to see some ground fog develop. For those in the ag sector, that's a good reminder of temperature inversions, which are something that folks are certainly interested in these days. And then the bottom slide there from Shelby County, just highlighting that we're kind of nearing the end of the hay season, and a lot of folks have been able to get out and in some cases put up a second cutting of hay. Looking at precipitation now over the last 30 days, this map shows a lot of green with a little bit of blue in there, and maybe blue is a misnomer in terms of the color. That's an indication of drier conditions. So we're looking again at two data sets laid on top of one another. You've got the radar estimated precipitation totals with the color coding. And then on top of that, we have observed values from the Kentucky Mesonet stations across the state. I kind of recognize that some of those numbers with the black font are difficult to read, and we're trying to figure out a way to control the font color, but we haven't gotten there yet. In any case, you can focus here on that blue area that represents areas over the last 30 days that have received somewhere in the 1 to 2 inch range of precipitation, small area with estimates that are less than an inch. And then around that, some lighter green in the 2 to 4 inches, which would mean those areas are a little bit below normal for this time of year. But as we're going to talk about going forward here today, the story here is not just the precipitation totals, it's the more comprehensive view of the weather conditions that we experienced through July. So this lack of precipitation in a portion of Kentucky there is going to be a theme here going forward. Other than that, though, you can see many areas of the state continue to receive above normal precipitation from the west, where we had 6-7 inches over near the Mississippi River, and back over to the east and northeast, where we had locations that received 5, 6, 7 inches or more of precipitation there. So a very different story depending on where you were across the state during the month of July. Going out to 60 days, keep in your mind the areas that were getting dry here over the last month. And when you look at the 60-day totals, those numbers are much, much larger. And that's because the same areas that were receiving somewhere in the order of 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches, some cases, of rain during July, those same areas were receiving anywhere 6, 7, 8 to 9 inches of precipitation during the month of June. And so when you put those together, you see ample precipitation even in the areas that are starting to show a little bit of dryness across the state. But that's an important thing to keep in mind because, again, we've had very wet conditions generally throughout the year up to this point or up to recently. And while it is getting dry in some areas, we need to keep in mind that there's still a lot of moisture in the environment. And we branch out and go back now to the 90-day totals. And again, we can see that most areas across the state are in the 15 to 20 or even more higher totals of precipitation, with the largest estimated amounts in southeastern Kentucky and parts of northeastern Kentucky. I would note here as you look at this map that there is really for the first time that since we've started the webinars, a little more disagreement between the radar estimated totals and some of our observed totals with the Kentucky Mesonet stations. And it appears that the radar estimates are higher, a bit higher than some of our observed totals in some parts of the state. So you can kind of look around and get a sense of that if you compare the colors, which are showing in the reds of 20 to 25 inches. We're generally a bit under that in terms of the observed totals. But again, no matter how you look at it, 90-day period has been a wet period for Kentucky. Now kind of pulling that all together, we look at this graphic, again, a lot of different colors here. We've got the 30-day, 60 and 90-day maps, but not the total precipitation. Here we're looking at the percent of normal. So if you look at the axis scaling, then so we've got the same scale for each of the maps, so we can compare them easily. If you're looking at the pale yellows and oranges and even a little bit of red, those are areas that have been below normal in terms of precipitation. And if you look at the areas that are in the greens and the blues to the purples, those are areas that have been above normal precipitation. So again, taking a look at the 30-day totals, we can see that there's a significant drying that is occurring in a portion of Kentucky, kind of centered around Louisville and going off in all directions around there. And while we're focused on Kentucky, it's probably worth noting that as you look to our north into the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, you see much larger areas that are also showing below normal precipitation during that 30-day period. But again, as we noted on the last couple slides, once you look at the 60 and 90-day totals, you see a very different picture, and nearly all of the state for those periods is well above normal in terms of precipitation. Again, in some cases, in many areas, 150, 200% or even more of what would be normal precipitation for Kentucky. So as such, looking at 30-day versus the longer term, it appears that we're starting to see a shift in terms of the pattern as we see a larger area of dryness developing that that we really have not seen per se this year. Now shifting over to temperatures, because they do become part of the story here for the month, this past month. We're looking at, on the left, the average daily maximum temperature in departure from the long-term average. And then on the right-hand side, we'll look at the departure of temperatures from the long-term average minimum temperature. So on the left-hand side, we see most of Kentucky's in gray, but we've got a little bit of kind of tan orange, which indicates above normal high temperatures for the state. Those were contained in the northern area, again, sort of around the Louisville up to Cincinnati corridor and extending a little bit south, and then slightly below normal high temperatures in the Jackson Purchase area in far western Kentucky. But all in all, when you look at the average high temperatures for the month, they were statewide pretty close to where we would expect for the month of July. On the other hand, if we look at the low temperatures, it's a bit of a different story. There we see really the entire state that's in shades of orange, indicating above normal average daily low temperatures, anywhere from 1 to 2 degrees over the southern tier of the state and western part, to as much as 3 to 4 degrees above normal in a few areas there along the Ohio River. Take note, though, that if we think back over the month, and we'll talk about this going forward here, you may recall that the first 3 months or first 3 weeks of the month, we saw very, very warm overnight low temperatures. And then we had a change in the weather pattern with some cooler, drier air that came in. And that's kind of highlighted here in this next map. This is showing just for one particular day, July 19th, which was right in that period when we were under a heat advisory. And you'll recall that much of the Midwest and Northeast was suffering from extreme heat. So these were the overnight low minimum temperatures on July 19th. And we could have picked some other dates. We saw this same kind of pattern for several days in July. And so it was all in all a very uncomfortable month because of the very humid air mass that dominated for the first 3 weeks. And again, it was an accomplishment in many areas to see the temperature drop below 70 degrees overnight. Now moving on to looking at soil moisture conditions, and we've got a couple products that we've been using. There are lots of others out there that we could work in, but on the left we're looking at the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center calculated soil moisture ranking percentile, and this is a snapshot as of July 30th. You can see some green there around Kentucky, and indicating that much of the state is above normal in some of the upper percentiles in terms of soil moisture, 70 to 80th percentile, and otherwise in northeastern Kentucky we're in that 30 to 70 range, which could be thought of as pretty much near normal for this time of year. So anywhere from normal to above normal soil moisture across the state based on those calculated values. And then on the right-hand side, really trying to get at the same thing, but it's just a different approach, using some satellite remote sensing imagery too. And you've got a lot of blues there that are indicating values in the higher wetness percentiles, but some areas starting to dry out in Kentucky. And of course, this is a national map. If you were to compare the map we're looking at today with the one that we showed last week, you would see that there's a little bit less blue on there, and certainly across the Midwest and into Missouri and such. So starting to see some drying out across not just parts of Kentucky, but parts of the larger region. The evaporative demand drought index is a particularly useful indicator of how conditions may be changing very rapidly and could give us a leading indication of whether we could be entering into a dry spell or not. So again, what this does is it's basically a measure of how thirsty the atmosphere is, how much water it wants to take up. So just like when you come in from mowing the lawn in this heat and you need something cold to drink. So when the atmosphere, when the humidity is low, the lower the humidity, the more solar radiation, the more wind, and the higher the temperature, the more water the atmosphere wants to take up from the environment. Now, the amount that it actually takes up is a function of how much is available. And for the most part, there has been plenty of water available in the environment based on all the precipitation that we've had. And again, that changed in some areas of the state that we saw earlier in the slides. So the key thing here is that what we saw over July with the high temperatures, and then later in the month, while it cooled down, the air became much drier. And so the atmosphere was even more interested in sucking moisture up to fill that void. So we've seen very rapid drying start to occur in Kentucky. And again, areas that have been wet, that has not necessarily been an issue. But for areas, if we continue to see a below normal precipitation pattern, if that starts to spread across Kentucky, and if the the atmospheric demand for water continues, as it would, again, if we're having high temperatures, clear skies, lower humidity and such, then we could see very rapid drying going forward. We've talked already in past webinars about some concern that there is out there with crops, and we're starting to get later in the growing season, but crops that did not have well-developed root systems. Again, we'll hit on that here a little bit later. Looking at some soil moisture graphs from the Kentucky Mesonet. These are 90-day plots, and again, if you look at the legend there, you can see that the kind of pale blue, silverish color is the 2-inch soil moisture. The little bit darker blue is 4 inches. The green is 8 inches, and so forth. And again, we just selected a few things. What I wanted to point out here, if you look at the left-hand side of this figure, we've got Fulton County, and Fulton County has been a poster child for areas of the state that have just remained wet pretty much throughout the year. And you can see that even though we've gotten into the summer months, there really has been very little depletion of soil moisture, even near surface soil moisture. And if you look deeper down at the 40-inch level, it's actually been increasing a little bit, and likewise recently increasing at the 20-inch level. On the lower left, we move over to the other end of the state. We're in Breathitt County, and we've got a station down there in the valley near Quicksand. You can see that there was a period, you may remember earlier this year in the spring, where we started to see some drying conditions, particularly in the eastern part of the state, and that's evident here as you go back to May, where we've got some lower soil moisture levels, but with recent precipitation. And again, it's been spotty in terms of the areas that have had particularly heavy precip, but soil moisture levels have certainly recovered. And again, this is down in a stream valley. But if you look at the right-hand side, we picked a couple locations that are in the portion of the state that has received less precipitation recently. Meade County, kind of in the bullseye of that region, and then LaRue County, a little bit farther south and a little bit farther east. So there, again, what you see is that the soil moisture in the upper levels of the soil has been dropping pretty rapidly here over the last few weeks. And again, consistent with what we just talked about, the lack of precipitation in those areas combined with the thirsty atmosphere that wants to take the available moisture out of the soil. Okay, move from soil to stream flows. 7-day average stream flow, generally values that are in the normal to above normal range. One location there in the Green River Basin, I think that's on the Rough River, that's a little bit below normal, but otherwise stream flows certainly look pretty good and reflect the wet conditions we've had for most of this year. The 28-day totals, going back a little bit farther, before we started drying out in some areas, and you can see the stream flows again are in the normal to above normal, but in this case we've got a few places on the 28-day average that are much above normal in terms of stream flows. Again, all in all, plenty of water still out there in the environment. Okay. No flooding conditions to be concerned about at this time. In previous months, we had some brighter colors showing up on the lower Ohio and over there on the Mississippi. Those have essentially disappeared here in the state of Kentucky. Moving on to the U.S. Drought Monitor release for today earlier, and we can take a look. A lot of white. Again, a theme has been nationwide the remarkably low percentage of areas that have been in any stage of drought. And the color that you see on there, the predominant one is the yellow, representing abnormally dry. So that's not a drought condition. Abnormally dry does not mean drought, but it's could be a precursor to that. So we're starting to see a little bit more abnormally dry conditions pop up around the country, but nonetheless, there is nowhere in the country that is in D3 or D4. That is extreme or exceptional drought, and just a remarkable condition. This slide is showing how the drought monitor status has changed over the last month. And so the yellowish areas that we see there in the Midwest across Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, those all represent abnormally dry conditions that have just developed over the last month. And again, you can see a little bit more yellow than you do green, indicating that we're starting to see some drying out in some places. But around Kentucky, if you look to our south, really kind of interesting, a hodgepodge of things. We've got some areas that have seen a degradation of conditions. That is, it's getting drier into some stage of concern for drought developing. But other areas, in some cases, in very close proximity to the places where degradation is occurring, we're seeing improvement in drought conditions. And closest to Kentucky would be that small area there in far western Tennessee, where there were some abnormally dry conditions last month, and those have disappeared. So really nothing that's sitting out there on our borders and posing a threat or giving an indication that we may be entering a drought condition here in Kentucky based on something that could be moving or diffusing into our area. And again, this slide is basically a placeholder again this month, and nothing going on in Kentucky right now. So we've taken a look at everything from precipitation to temperatures. We've looked at soil conditions, we looked at stream flows and such. So now let's shift to impacts. And here we've summarized National Weather Service local storm reports that came in over the last 30 days. And kind of go through, you get a big list into an Excel spreadsheet basically of details of different reports, and basically just try to go through those and hit the highlights. So you looked at the month of July, essentially. It was remarkable that the first 3 weeks of the month, essentially I think up through the 22nd, there were storm reports coming in almost daily. Every now and then you'd miss a day where there was nothing reported, but it was a nearly daily event that somewhere across the state there were storm reports coming in. And those reports for the month were almost exclusively either damaging winds or heavy rainfall that may have triggered flash flooding in areas. So there are a few other reports, but that's what dominated over the month. And you can see they're scattered across the state, a little bit more concentration there in the bluegrass region. And as you get into the eastern half of the state, just pulled out a few tidbits to highlight. And one being there in Bell County, where flash flooding trapped some people in their houses for a period of time. Highlighted Madisonville because they had two separate events a week apart, where they had reports of flash flooding occurring somewhere in the Madisonville area, and mainly affecting roads, but some impacts, some minor impacts in terms of buildings there. And then an interesting event that you don't see very often was high water over the Interstate 64 near Mount Sterling on the 11th of July in the evening. So what we don't have on here, and I guess it didn't show up in the storm report, was the lightning strike at the distillery, the warehouse that occurred earlier in the month. So that probably had the biggest economic impact of any of these, but not in the list of storm reports. Whoops, hit the wrong button here. Going on to agricultural impacts, and want to give credit again to Matt Dixon and his folks there at the University of Kentucky Ag Weather Center up the road in Lexington. And Matt couldn't be with us this week, taking a little bit of vacation time while I can get it. But he sent me a report, and so I wanted to go through and highlight a few things here. Again, the wet conditions in early July led to some issues with prevented planting claims, that farmers were not able to get out in fields to plant crops, and so could put in claims for payments there. And then again, this common theme that we've mentioned before and remains a concern about the stunting of crop root system development in the low-lying or poorly drained fields in some portions of the state, and certainly there in the Mississippi River Basin there, we've had long-term flooding that's only recently kind of eased. Transition from harvesting winter wheat to planting double crop soybeans essentially complete by now. Excessive heat in mid-July, followed by the dry weather and lower humidity, contributed to rapid drying, except some areas that got hit with thunderstorms, and again, some of those are very heavy storms. But again, raised concerns for the areas where we do have issues with crop root system development, that this drying, rapid drying, may have an enhanced and adverse effect on those crops. If we look at the bottom, we've got the weekly crop report on the left, the progress of crops, highlighting different crop development stages. And I won't go through and read all of those, but you can look down there, whether you're talking about corn, soybeans, or tobacco. If you look at this week and compare it to last year and compare it to the 5-year average, we're basically running a little bit behind normal in all cases. So it's just been a slow year, and again, largely reflecting the difficulty that farmers had in terms of being able to get crops out in the field this spring. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at crop conditions for the month, and the predominant category there is good. And then if you look for the most part, you've got about an equal balance. Well, I shouldn't say that. You've got either an equal balance between fair and excellent, or a little bit more on the fair side. So probably all in all, we'd say good or fair to good conditions for most of agriculture across the state. And before I move on, just point out that those percentages for Kentucky are certainly better than a lot of our surrounding states. Here we've got, I wanted to throw in a couple slides. Our mesonet technicians were over in Fulton County recently to do a site maintenance visit on our station there, and they stopped to take a couple pictures, really highlighting the impact of the very wet conditions on fields and crop development there in that part of the state. And again, in the lower right, even as it's been drying out with all the moisture in the environment and continuing to get periodically heavy thunderstorms, just the field flooding issues just don't seem to want to go away in an area of the state that's prone to that. And then a couple slides from, I think, Twitter posts that Matt passed along. Just a reminder to be on the lookout, be monitoring for crop diseases. And with the climatic conditions, very humid conditions we've had here in the state until recently, it's something where there's some elevated concern. Now, moving forward, beyond impacts, now looking ahead, the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast. Again, we kind of try to focus in a little bit on Kentucky, but we're looking at the U.S. And if you can find Kentucky on there, you're looking at some different shades of green, and those are areas that are indicating precipitation amounts anywhere from essentially just a 1/10 of an inch or less to as much as maybe a 1/2 an inch of precipitation forecast over the next 7 days. So drier than normal conditions anticipated across Kentucky over the next week. A little bit more rain maybe down in the southeast and the Pine Mountain, Black Mountain areas there in southeastern Kentucky, but generally a drier pattern likely to continue over the next few days. The 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day precipitation outlooks, both of them indicating a slightly enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation for most of Kentucky, and rather large areas of the U.S. and the plains that are expected to be or have an enhanced likelihood of above normal precipitation, in some cases much enhanced compared to what we have here in Kentucky. So this pattern's reflects a little bit of a change. So we just looked at the next 7 days, likely below normal, but a slightly enhanced likelihood. Then as we go out, that 6 to 10, 8 to 14 day outlook. But if we look at the month of August, and we'll start on the right since we're talking about precipitation, for the month as a whole, there's a portion of Kentucky now that is in an area designated with a slightly enhanced likelihood of below normal precipitation. Again, slightly enhanced is exactly that. It's not a guarantee that will be below normal. It just means that if the area that's white is equal chances, meaning a 33% chance of being below normal, near normal, or above normal, and that slightly enhanced means that the probability of being drier, instead of 33%, it looks like it's about 40%. And then to contrast that, the likelihood of being above normal instead of a 33% would be down to about 26% or thereabouts. Temperatures over the month of August are anticipated to be below normal in the Midwest and Great Plains, and even extending down to portions of Kentucky. We've got a slightly enhanced probability of being below normal in terms of temperature. There's an upper level trough that is expected to be in place, kind of dominate the weather pattern in the upper plains and Great Lakes area, eastern U.S. area, and that could bring us a little bit cooler temperatures, a little more airflow from the north, as opposed to the common pattern of the advection of moisture and air and humid air from the south. So we'll see how that plays out going forward. That outlook was updated. Originally, the original outlook for August came out in the middle of July, but this one was updated, as they have been recently, yesterday. So it's just hot off the presses as of July 31st. So the seasonal outlook, I see I have a typo there I need to fix on the top of the slide. Seasonal outlook for August, September, and October for Kentucky, looking at temperatures. About half the state has equal chances of above, near, or below normal, and the eastern half slightly elevated chance of above normal temperatures over that period. Other than that, though, you see that across the country, large portions of the west and the east coast, southeast, have an elevated likelihood of above normal temperatures, and that reflects in large part just climatological trends of warming conditions over those portions of the U.S. And then on the right, the precipitation outlook for Kentucky, equal chances. There are no strong signals driving a precipitation forecast for us. There does appear to be some indication of a continued wet pattern in the plains. Monthly stream flow outlook comes from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Jim Knoll and our friends there in Wilmington, Ohio, and includes almost all of Kentucky. We would like to try to get them to make a product that includes that little portion that comes out of the lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. But lots of normal in there for this time of year in August. Normal stream flows projected over the next month. Nothing to get too excited about there. It's good news. And then areas with a greater than 50% chance of flooding, basically no elevated risk indicated anywhere in the region at this point. So this is the first time that we're really seeing a lot of green no matter where you look on the map. So to summarize all of this, many areas of Kentucky continue to experience above normal precipitation, areas 6, 7, 8 inches of rain, and very strong thunderstorms associated with that. But we saw dryness start to set in over significant portions of the state. And again, that represented a change in the pattern for us. First three weeks of July were extremely humid with high overnight temperatures, capped off by a heat wave with heat index values in the 100 to 110 range. Again, you think back to that, it was not our high temperatures that were the problem. It was the extremely high dew points, high humidity in the atmosphere that was the culprit primarily. But then we saw cooler and drier weather come in over the last week or more of the month and really kind of changed the weather pattern and changed a lot of people's attitudes, I think, for the better. So the above normal or above conditions that we just talked about led to an elevated atmospheric thirst for water, resulting in rapid drying. There's still concern about the potential for flash drought and vulnerability of crops with impaired root system development. So we'll be real interested to see how things proceed here over these next 30 days or so. So some vulnerability out there, even though we've been remarkably wet for most of the year. And looking ahead then, again, August brings a slightly enhanced likelihood of cooler than normal and drier than normal conditions over portions of the state. So that's it in a so-called nutshell for the last 30 days and looking out ahead for the next 30 days or so. Be happy to take any questions that you might have. If you want to talk about anything that we've brought up, feel free to chime in there. I think Megan's in a position where she can accept any questions, comments, whatever we might have. And otherwise, again, keep in mind next month will be on September 5th, and Chip Zimmer with Division of Water will be leading the effort. Thank you so much.
All right, if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute your microphone and we can answer whatever you have. All right, if there are no other questions, we will go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Have a good day.